Welcome to Best Evidence. I'm John Titus. Today I want to do a video that follows up a presentation that I gave for Doctors for COVID Ethics at an online symposium concerning the pandemic as a monetary event. And the format for that symposium was each presenter had 20 minutes, which gave me enough time to just touch on some really important points. So in this video, what I do really is beef up that presentation to delve into some key points about the monetary system that explain really what's going on and that are not widely understood. Let me back up a bit. 5 years ago on this channel, I explained that there had been a coup d'etat by criminal bankers who were not being investigated at all by the Department of Justice in the U.S. in the wake of the financial crisis. And the two videos that really carried the message there were The Veneer of Justice in a Kingdom of Crime and All the Plenary's Men, at the end of which I warned that killing the rule of law as we had in the U.S. was not going to turn out well at all, because essentially you're leaving criminals in charge of the system and giving them free rein. And here we are 5 years later in a real mess. So in this video, what I want to do is explain forensically how bankers have started implementing totalitarian control across the world under the cover of what I'm going to call pandemic. And by pandemic, I don't mean the pandemic. I mean the 24/7 saturation news coverage, the horror story, the fear porn, all the rest. The bankers don't care about any sort of scientific event. They don't care about your health. They do care, however, about 24/7 fear porn and news coverage, because it can drive behavior, and that's exactly what they're after. So when I'm just going to refer generally to what's going on as pandemic, like the feature film that we've all been treated to for the last 18 months. So I'm going to eliminate the article before pandemic, the feature. The censorship and open criminality that you see now are child's play to what's coming, and that is central bank digital currency, or CBDC, which is the tool of choice for the criminal bankers in charge that they are going to use to control every transaction that you might propose to undertake. The people running our monetary system now are actually quite open and brazen about their desire for totalitarianism and for complete financial control over everyone's life. And in that vein, I want to show you two examples of very high-ranking bankers who've been instrumental in building out the monetary gulag that they've admittedly are dreaming about as they ponder visions of totalitarianism for you and me. So let me just queue up these videos here. And the first banker here is Larry Fink. He is the CEO of BlackRock, which has something like $9 trillion under management. And here Larry is going to share his vision about what a healthy market is and what it likes. Pay attention to this.
Uncertainty. Markets don't like uncertainty. Markets like actually totalitarian governments where you have a understanding of what's out there, and obviously the whole dimension is changing now with, as you said, a democratization of countries, and democracies are very messy, as we know in the United States. You have opinions changing back and forth.
Can't have that. People changing their positions in democracies. That's Larry doesn't like that. Totalitarian Larry prefers complete control over everyone. And that's just that. Thank you for your candor, Larry. His firm, actually, BlackRock, comes into play a little bit later because, horrifyingly enough, BlackRock was actually hired by the Federal Reserve during pandemic to do some very key things, which we'll get to that in a little bit. The next guy I want to show you, though, is Agustin Carstens. He is the head of the Bank for International Settlements. He's the general manager. I mean, that's just for now. It's just a major international player, the BIS, that is coordinating the goose step or lockstep move towards CBDC. And I want you to listen to this clip because this is where we are headed. So let's take a look at Agustin Carstens. Here we go.
Now, in all our analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash. And there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that.
Okay, absolute control over the rules and regulations of that expression of central bank liability. That expression of central bank liability is a fancy way of saying of your money. And so what Carstens here is proposing is that when you propose to engage in retail transactions, the central bank will have complete control over that transaction. It can decline that transaction. So when you go to the Burger Mart, the Shoney's, and you want to order the double cheeseburger there, the central bank will simply look. They can look at your social credit score or look at whatever they want and say, no, 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 you can't have a double cheeseburger. At most, you can have a single cheeseburger if you're lucky enough to have meat at all. And this here, this extra mayonnaise, that's no good. That's not good for you. Your climate coefficient is too high for that, so we're going to have to take that away from you. No burger for you. And that is Carstens' vision for central bank digital currency. And I'm here to tell you that is coming. They are going to implement the central bank digital currency, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But for now, central bank digital currency is still, right now, probably 3 to 4 years off. But a crucial phase of the transition by the monetary system to a central bank digital currency system just took place under the very thick cover of, yes, pandemic. No one seemed to notice what was going on. But in order to fully appreciate the role played by pandemic and what's going on, you need to see clearly how our current monetary system is blocking totalitarians like Larry and Carstens there from absolute control over your lives via CBDC. And I'm going to do this from a U.S. perspective, but I want you to understand that all monetary systems in the Western world, and really throughout the world, with precious few exceptions, all operate the same way. It's a two-tiered system, and they're all debt-based. I'll leave it at that for now. But just because I'm using the Fed as an example, the Federal Reserve in the U.S., the central bank, rest assured that the discussion here applies with equal force to jurisdictions across the world. So the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Royal Bank of Australia, all of those, they're all headed toward, the People's Bank of China, they're all headed toward central bank digital currency, to be sure. What the criminals want, as Carstens just said, is complete control over every retail transaction with digital money issued by the Federal Reserve, which is what central bank digital currency is. Now, let's just stop right there. You might say, well, if the Fed already issues electronic money, and you and I already use electronic money in retail transactions as it is, so what's the Fed's problem? What is it lacking? You know, what's so different about CBDC? And that's a good threshold question. The Fed's problem and what it's missing is it can only issue money into the wholesale monetary circuit, whereas the money that you and I use, our money, circulates inside the retail circuit. And we have a split circuit system. And so it's the split circuit system right now that's standing in the way of totalitarians taking total control of the entire money supply. But the split circuit system was breached, seriously breached, while everybody was fixated on pandemic. So nobody noticed this serious breach, and it's what I want to talk about here. Because it's both a strategic move by the central banks and it preceded pandemic by months. But to really get into this and understand it, we first need to look at the split circuit monetary system to understand what happened. Split circuit, by the way, that term is Joseph Huber's term from a book that he wrote in 2017 called Sovereign Money. And he pointed out, I read it probably the next year, 2018, he says, if you don't understand the split circuit system, as I did not, you simply are going to be lost in discussions about the monetary system which I most certainly was until I got a hold of that book. And I was like, oh, didn't know that. And he's right about being confused without understanding the split circuit system, which is probably why so few people know about the split circuit system. I mean, the powers that be like it that way. They like people ignorant. So what I want to do here is lay it out nice and clear to the consternation of Larry and Carstens. And so here we go with the split circuit system. Let's take a look at it. Okay. The split circuit monetary system. To be clear, we are talking about a circuit, two circuits actually, but circuit implies electronics. That's what we're talking about, electronic money, digital money, another way of putting it. What we are not talking about is cash. You just heard Carstens said they hate cash because they don't know who's using it, they don't know what they're spending it on, and the totalitarians, they don't like that. So we're not talking about cash here today, we're talking about electronic money and how that control is going to be implemented. What is a split circuit? It's exactly like it sounds. It's two different circuits. One circuit I'll call the retail circuit. That's our circuit that we use to conduct our business. And the other circuit is what I'll call the wholesale circuit. That's really sort of a bookkeeping circuit, which I'll explain. But the retail circuit is private, and it's a private circuit because the issuers of money in the retail circuit are private entities. They're commercial banks. And in the wholesale circuit, the issuers of money are, at least in theory, public. That's the official story, is that public entities, for example, the Federal Reserve in the U.S., issue money because it's really that right to do that. The issuance of money is a sovereign right belonging to a nation, and in theory, the Federal Reserve is the I laugh when I say it, is the agent of we the people. Just a ludicrous notion, but be that as it may, that is the official story. So the wholesale circuit, the issuer of money, is public. It is the Federal Reserve. The team colors I'm going to choose here are red for the retail circuit, the private circuit, and we are going to go with a bleak blue for the wholesale circuit, which is, like I say, it's the bookkeeping circuit that really kind of is meant to sort of settle transactions in the private circuit, but I'll talk about that in a bit. We're going to see these colors again. I'm not doing this for no reason in graphs that come up. So when you see red, that's our circuit. That's the retail circuit. And when you see blue, that's the Fed, that's Carstens and those guys. And so that's the color scheme. But I'll go back to it and explain it at the time when it comes up as we go. The private circuit, let's take a look at that. In the private circuit, as I say, the issuer of money is commercial banks. Commercial banks issue money. They create it out of thin air when they lend. And then that money is circulated among bank money users, some of whom have taken out those loans, and then they pay that money back. The money is destroyed. New loans are created, and the loans get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's just how the system works. For a long time, there was a debate among economists, actually a long time, meaning like 100 years, about whether commercial banks did in fact create money out of thin air, or whether when they lent money, they were getting that money from some pre-existing pile of pre-accumulated capital and lending that out. That's how you and I lend. We reach into our pocket and we lend that money out. Commercial banks do not do that. They create it out of thin air. But there was a debate about that for, like I say, 100 years. It was finally laid to rest, that debate, definitively put to rest, in a paper, in a brilliant paper by Professor Richard Werner called "Can Banks Individually Create Money Out of Nothing?" I leave a footnote in the description box so you can click on it. I'll leave a link. And this paper in 2014, Werner proves, not only beyond a shadow of a doubt, he forensically proves, really, or mathematically proves, really, like in a QED sense, that commercial banks do indeed create money out of thin air when they lend. I was so impressed by this paper that I made a video out of it called "Mommy, Where Does Money Come From?" Which dumbed the paper down quite a bit, apparently to the authors, to Werner's consternation, as I learned in subsequent emails, Be that as it may, if you want to see that commercial banks do create money out of thin air when they lend, you can watch my video. There's a link in the description box, or you can read Werner's paper. Either way, that's no longer disputed. Commercial banks create money when they lend. So now let's look at the circuit of people who use that money. And let me answer a question or address something really quickly about commercial banks creating money when they lend. You might be saying, well, I have electronic money in my bank account or checking account, and I didn't take out any loan. So you'd be like me. I didn't borrow the money. So what are you talking about? That's true. I didn't borrow the money. You didn't borrow the money in your account, but that electronic money sitting there, if you could trace it back to its source, sort of in a Genesis begat sort of way, and you went up the chain, you would find that the source of that money, it originated in a loan. There's no question about that. So even though you didn't take out the loan yourself, you're using money that it originated in a loan, to be sure. No doubt about that. Okay, who uses the retail bank money circuit? The commercial banks issue the money. Who uses it? Generally speaking, the users of retail money or bank money are non-bank entities. So businesses, we're talking about mom and pop businesses, industrial businesses, commercial businesses, really any business is not a commercial bank, including, financial businesses like, hedge funds and insurance companies. They are part of they transact business in retail bank money. That's one big class of users. The other major class of users are just people like you and me, just to finish off that circuit with a bit of cheese there. That's the retail bank money circuit, and that completes the circuit. There are 4,357 commercial banks issuing money. That's a bit much for the criminals, the totalitarians, to control. They don't like that. That's too many to control. That number, by the way, comes from the FDIC's quarterly statistics at a glance report. There's over 4,000 commercial banks in the U.S. all chugging away, issuing money. And that completes the private circuit. Now let's turn to the public circuit. As I said, the issuer of money in the public circuit is the Federal Reserve. It issues money when it does anything. When it wants to buy an asset, it just writes basically a check against nothing and begins buying assets. Who is in, and that's what it's done since 2008. The Federal Reserve it creates money out of thin air, just like commercial banks do. Who is using money in this circuit? Broadly speaking, there are three classes of users. There are central banks like the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan, and so on, Bank of England. That's one class of users. The other major class of users, the second, is the U.S. government, including, most importantly, the U.S. Treasury. And finally, far and away, the biggest user of money in the wholesale monetary circuit is commercial banks. So they appear in both circuits, but here they appear in blue and with a square around them. The square representing the fact that they are using money in this circuit. They are transacting in blue money. They are not issuing blue money. Blue money is issued by the Fed. There are not 4,000 issuers of money in this circuit. There are only 12. The 12 being the regional Federal Reserve banks. So the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Bank of San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, so on. There's 12 of them, but really there's one. It's the New York Fed. The New York Fed is the only one that has a trading desk. It's a permanent member of the Open Market Committee. The other 11 are just appendages. There's really one, but officially there are 12. And really, it's considered the Fed, like I say, as a public entity. But the point here being it's a much smaller group of issuers, even if you were to count all 12. So that really completes the public circuit. And we'll see what that money is doing, since it doesn't get in the retail circuit and we can't spend it. Why do we have that circuit? I'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's it. Let's talk about, and both circuit, by the way, are in dollars. They're both, the money circulating is in dollars. It's denominated the same. But there's a bit different nomenclature associated with each type of money. In the private circuit, it's sometimes called bank money because commercial banks issue that money. And in the public circuit, it is called reserves. It's issued by the Federal Reserve. It's called different things in different jurisdictions. But in any case, Both of those circuits, we have deposits. In the retail circuit, you and I have deposits sitting somewhere at the 400,357 banks. And there's more deposits than that because there's some banks that aren't commercial banks. But that gives you a sense. There's a lot, hundreds of millions of deposit accounts. The aggregate of the deposits at the commercial banks is reported weekly in the Fed's H.8 report. That is tabulated on Wednesday. It is reported on Thursday. So if you want to know, the total amount of money on deposit at commercial banks, go to the H.8 report. You can see it there. The Federal Reserve account holders, so the central banks and the U.S. government and commercial banks themselves, they all keep deposit accounts too at the Fed. But those accounts are being held at 12 different regional Federal Reserves banks. And the sum total of deposits by holders of accounts at the Fed is also reported weekly. It is reported in the H.4.1 report. Again, it is tabulated on Wednesday and it is reported on Thursday. So that tells you right there that it is indeed a split circuit. There's two separate reports to track the deposits at the two different tiers in our monetary system. And those two tiers, people think of the monetary system as being one tier, and that leads to a lot of confusion. There's two, rest assured. We'll see this. But let's look at the split circuit monetary system maybe another way, graphically, to underscore one key point about it. So here we have split circuit monetary system, and on the left we have the public circuit, where I'm going to simplify the diagram. It's the Federal Reserve is issuing money to commercial banks, and it is circling back to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve might buy an asset from a commercial bank, which turns around, sells it back to the Fed. That's a basic stripped down circuit. The retail circuit on the right, in red, the commercial banks are issuing money. Again, I'm going to simplify this. They issue money to you and me. They issue it in the form of loans. We pay the money back, and the cycle begins anew. And that's really the system. I wanted to do this diagram, though, because you could see here in the center of the diagram, the commercial banks occupy a special position in the two-tiered split circuit monetary system. They are both issuers and users of money in the center here. So you could really draw a box around them. Now, you and I in the retail circuit, we keep our money on deposit at the commercial banks, which in turn keep their money on deposit at the Fed. So there you have two different systems of deposits. And there's a couple things worth noting here. One, deposits in the retail circuit, those are the deposits that would go into anything. They make retail purchases, including purchases in the stock market. Okay, so if you want to drive up the equity market, you need to control the retail circuit. The wholesale circuit's not going to do you any good, at least not directly, because nobody transacts in reserves. The second point worth noting is that the Fed, for a very, very long time, only indirectly controlled the amount of deposits. Obviously, the Fed can completely control the blue deposits in the wholesale circuit, but its control over deposits in the retail circuit and money in the retail circuit was limited, historically limited, because it was tinkering. What the Fed would do is tinker with interest rates on deposits in the wholesale circuit, and tinkering with interest rates on deposits in the wholesale circuit would cause, in sympathy, an interest rate increase, say, in the retail circuit, and that would limit the number of deposits. It would tend to restrict the number of deposits because at a higher interest rate, fewer people are inclined to take out loans. So it was a very indirect system of control, and that has changed. That changed under the cover of pandemic. That has changed very much. But the Feds, the totalitarians, they don't like this system. They want direct control. They're going to get rid of the public-private distinction. They are going to change the two-tier system and then replace it with a central bank digital currency system in which the commercial banks are no longer going to issue money, and so that you can dismantle the channels of the monetary channels there. And eventually what you're going to end up with is a system where our deposits, they're going to be on deposit with the Fed, and you'll have one circuit here. The Fed will issue money to you and me, and that will complete that circuit, and we'll have one big happy totalitarian system, and that will be that. That is where we are headed. That is what Carstens is talking about. We can control your transactions. You can't have that double cheeseburger. Forget about it. I'll have that double cheeseburger. In fact, I'll have 3 or 4 double cheeseburgers. But for now, we have this system, the split circuit monetary system, and that's what the Fed wants to change. And as I say, there was a serious breach of the system in that the Fed began to exert direct pressure on deposits, and we're going to see that. The indirect method of jimmying interest rates to force changes or to induce changes in the retail system was jettisoned during pandemic, and they went with a direct method of control, the Fed did, and I'm going to show you that. So now that we see, yes, reserves exist at the Fed in one set of deposits, and bank money exists in banks in a totally different set of deposits, let's see how those two sets of deposit relate before and after pandemic. And for this, I'm going to need to go to the Fed's own website. Fred, it's the St. Louis Fed. It's a website called Fred that keeps just an inordinate amount of data. It's actually kind of awesome what the data they have over there. But I'm going to go over here and show you the the different reports, the two different sets of deposits. So let me do this. The way to bring up, I first want to do the wholesale circuit. So, and I got to be careful with the way I type here. The software I'm using, there's no deleting anything. So if I got to get it exactly right, or I got to do a big reset. Deposits, okay, less elimination. That ought to be good. Okay, good. Worked out. That's what I want. This is money on deposit at the Fed. These are the account holders at the Fed. This graph, let me blow this up so we can see it better. This graph goes back to 2002, late 2002. You can see the gray bars here. These gray bars correspond to recessions. There's a big gray bar here corresponding to 2008, 2009 global financial crisis. There is a skinny 2-month bar that is the alleged recession, the length of 2-month recession that occurred during pandemic. And you can see that deposits went way up during both pandemic, and they started going up during the global financial crisis. This noise you see here, this is reverse repos. I will talk about that briefly in a bit. But that's the graph of the wholesale monetary circuit. Notice down here, so it really divides into 3 phases. Down here is really the bookkeeping function that is being served by the wholesale circuit. The wholesale circuit is just used, its real purpose is just the wholesale money, which doesn't circulate in the public. It's like tokens that are used to settle transactions between customers of commercial banks in the retail circuit. And it's basically zero. It's not quite zero, but it's 16 billion, 23 billion. It's a tiny amount of money compared to this 6 to 8 trillion. And I have a video on this. So about why we even have a split circuit system? Why do we even have reserves? Why do you have to have a separate set of deposits? That video is called Wherefore Art Thou Reserves. I've got a link in the description box. Click on it. I've got it queued up to the right timestamp. And I walk through an example of how reserves are used to settle transactions and the function they perform. During the second phase here, okay, which runs from the global financial crisis up to pandemic, this is really phase 2. This is when the Fed begins to play games with its ability to create reserves out of nothing. And it basically, what it's doing is it's creating reserves here to buy assets from commercial banks. And so the money that it gens up out of nothing, creates out of nothing, it doesn't circulate into the retail circuit. It's just buying assets from banks. It's a bailout of banks You know, a bank might have some crappy mortgage-backed securities on its books, and they're worth nothing. So the Fed gins up, you know, $1 billion, creates $1 billion of reserves out of thin air, and buys those from a commercial bank, saving the day for the commercial bank. And the Fed will tell you, the official story is, oh, we're just doing this to influence interest rates. We're lowering. It's going to lower interest rates, and it's going to spur lending in the retail circuit. That's a bunch of nonsense. It's a bailout. Okay. The third circuit, the third period here is pandemic. And I'll talk about this more, but you can see that the Fed begins in early 2018 to taper off the level of deposits in the wholesale system up until September 2019. And then things change. And then things really change under cover of the pandemic. And I'll talk more about that. But those are, you think of the wholesale circuit, there are three periods. And by the way, the period here up to the global financial crisis, when it starts to really ratchet up in September of 2008, keep in mind that period really goes on for 105 years, because the Fed was created in 1913. So there's 103 years of flat nothing. Then we have the financial crisis. It begins to bail out banks with, purchases of assets, quantitative easing. And then here, there's a different form of quantitative easing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Things changed quite a bit during the pandemic. But let's get out of that. And now I want to change this chart. Notice that it's in millions, and I don't want that. I want billions, because I'm going to add a chart of retail, and it's in billions. So I'm going to go ahead and change that now quickly by dividing by 1,000 to chop those millions down to size. It won't change the shape of the graph. It'll just change the axis over here. Yeah, there we go. So now it's really it's in billions, and that's what I want. But I want now to add a second. I want to add retail deposits to this graph, and it's going to show up in red. And there we go. Deposits, all commercial banks. Notice, if you could see, this graph's going to go back to 1973, and it's going to mess up the graph we have now. But I'm going to fix that. So let's add the data series. I'm going to add. There we go. Took a while. Internet's slow today. And you can see, I'm going to get rid of this. I don't need that. And you can see that it now goes back to 1973. It goes back to the Nixon administration. We don't want that. I want it back where it was before. So everything lines up. 2002, December 18. Bam. Okay. So here we go. Here's retail. You can see there's a lot more money. Let me blow this up so that tooltip isn't in the way. Here we go. So here's the 2002 up to the global financial crisis. The takeaway here is that the red line, the tooltip it's annoying me now. Let me get rid of tooltip real quick. Sorry about that. Tooltip, you gotta go. There we go. And blow that back up. Okay. So retail deposits are here in the red, and wholesale deposits, money on deposit at the Fed, is here in blue. The big takeaway here is that the red line does what the red line does, irrespective of the blue line, until pandemic, until some point. And you could see it somewhere in here. Suddenly the wholesale money, the reserves on deposit, begins exerting a massive influence on the retail deposits. Now, if you look at this is increasing. For a brief period here, you could see the wholesale deposits influencing the retail deposits briefly. And I mean, like, 3 or 4 weeks. And then the red line reverts back to its linear trend line, and that's that. And for the rest of the time, when the Fed is buying assets, it increases assets here, really doesn't have an effect. Assets are declining. The blue line is declining here, has no effect on the red line. Increases here, no effect. I mean, the red line is just a line up until some point. There's an inflection point where the blue line does, the wholesale deposits do influence retail deposits. And so now I need the tooltip back. Sorry to be so fickle, but that's just that. Let me come back, tooltip. Okay. Now, we were talking about when is the switchover from blue line has no effect on red line to you can see it definitely has an effect. One inflection point would be, February 26th. Things change in a big way right around then. So that's you could say it changed during the pandemic, and the pandemic did that, but that's not true. The more interesting inflection point is the Fed has been tapering here for about 18 months. And when it reverses and begins to add money back to deposits and begins to create reserves and shuffle them to banks, the reversal was caused by a crisis in the repo market. And what happened there is that a lot of people who would normally lend money into the repo market, like JP Morgan Chase, I'm looking at you, Jamie, pulled their money out of the repo market. And they'd been doing so for a month. One commentator in particular commented on this. And the Fed steps into the breach, and this is where it steps into the breach. And notice that when it steps into the breach and it starts to add money to the repo market, that it has a decisive effect. You could see that up there, much like here. You see that bump is clearly in sympathy with the red line is in sympathy with the blue line. And that's really the inflection point. And that would have occurred on, I'll blow it up here in a minute. I'll raise the red line in a minute. That's on September 11th, 2019. It's an interesting date for obvious reasons. But that's just how it shook out. The Fed enters the repo market that week and begins packing on reserves. And it begins to have an immediate effect on the retail market. And I'm going to show you that. I'm going to raise the blue line by adding money to it, just adding a constant to it. That, of course, will have no effect on the validity of the correlation, because R-squared values, which measure correlation, do not depend on any constant value. It's the DC offset component, as double E's would have it, has no effect on the correlation. So I'm just going to raise the blue line up to the red line so we can assess the correlation a bit more accurately. And so what I'm going to do is I want to edit line 1. And I want to add, I happen to know that the difference between those two lines is 11,190.44 cents. Let's apply that. There we go. Now get rid of you. Keeping tooltip, I hope, yes. Okay. So you can see that this is the real inflection point here, because the Fed had been decreasing its balances, its deposits, money on deposit at the Fed, and as soon as it reverses, it picks up the red line, and it's a lock. I mean, it's a no-doubter, and that continues into the pandemic. Now, this here, the blue line actually continues up. The Fed is still adding assets here, but it's taking measures. It's changed some interest rates around to induce deposit holders at the Fed to convert their deposits to reverse repos. There's a presentation or video by a guy named Stephen Van Metre called The Fed's Latest Scam. I'll link to it in the description box, where he explains what the Fed's doing here. It's actually really smart. The point of this is to drive up demand for treasuries. But in any event, check out Van Metre's video. It's very good. He walks through it pretty carefully. But for our purposes, what we see here is that the two periods, for this period here, the long period from really 1913 up until September 11th, 2019, wholesale deposits reserves on deposit at the Fed had no effect on the retail circuit. This, by the way, when the Fed began adding reserves and packing on money to its balance sheet, there were a lot of people, myself included, who thought that this would cause inflation. Because I thought, well, you're adding money to the system. I didn't understand the split circuit system, and that led me to think there'd be inflation, and there wasn't. And I was surprised, like, well, how could there not? How could you add all these trillions of dollars and there's no inflation? You're looking at it because there's no effect on the retail circuit. That's where we spend our money. That's where inflation would come from, is the red line. But notice here now, inflation's a real risk if the Fed keeps playing games here and adding to its balance sheet and creating new reserves to getting to the retail market. You can see here that something major changed. And I have a video that explains what's going on here, and it is called Quantitative Easing, the Greatest Sham Ever, that explains how this is happening. But the point here, for our purposes, is that there's two periods. There's pre-9/11-19 and there's post-9/11-19. And the change, the switchover occurred right here, and you're looking right at it, where additions of money to the wholesale circuit affect the red line. And that is really that. And I'll come back to that, but I think that is pretty crystal clear. And so let's think for a second about what you just saw. For 100 plus years, the Fed's creation of wholesale money, but never affected the retail money supply. And then all of a sudden it did. And that reversal, as I say, it occurred in September 2019 repo crisis, when all of a sudden retail, the private money supply, starts tracking the wholesale public money supply. And so the obvious question that we need to address now is why that happened and what caused that to happen. As it turns out, that reversal was actually planned. It was called for exactly in a policy plan written by BlackRock. So it was written by Totalitarian Larry's gang. They presented a plan on August 22nd, 2019. So it's 3 weeks before the repo crisis. Totalitarian Larry makes a presentation to the Fed. It was actually a big monetary conference at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It's held every year. All the big wigs go there, all the central bankers, all the financial players, the movers and shakers gather there every year. And they talk about what they're going to do with the world, I guess. And BlackRock gives this presentation. And they call this, they say, you're going to have another downturn. You can't make this stuff up. You're going to have there's going to be another downturn, and you Fed and you central bankers, you need to undertake an unprecedented policy and to respond to the crisis when it hits. And that's the plan. And that plan goes into effect 3 weeks later in the repo crisis, and it really kicks into high gear. And by high gear, I mean $4 trillion, not 3 or 4 billion like the repo crisis in September, but $3 to $4 trillion. That plan goes into effect when Pandemic begins airing in theaters across the U.S. in early 2020, and it provides the cover for BlackRock to execute its plan. And in fact, the Fed even hires BlackRock to come in to the Fed and pick which assets to buy, including assets that are being sold by BlackRock. Yeah. So the Fed says to BlackRock, hey, come on in and help us out. Help us pick the assets. And yeah, we'll sign a waiver so that you can pick your own assets, that you can be on both sides of the trade. Wouldn't that be great? I mean, tell me that didn't come from Totalitarian Larry Fink, huh? On both sides of the trade. They get a waiver to do that. So if the BlackRock is knee deep in this, they're actually up to their neck in this, the Pandemic production and buying of these assets and enriching themselves. But because everyone is raving about Pandemic, the TV tale, they are not seeing the BlackRock/Fed monetary dog wagging that tail. And so let's take a look at BlackRock's plan and see what the plan called for and what went on here. Okay, here we go. Here's the BlackRock plan. It is called, the title there, Dealing with the Next Downturn. Like I say, it is dated August of 2019. The presentation was actually on the 22nd. Let's just zoom down and cut right to it. And you can see there in the very first bullet point, there is not enough monetary policy space to deal with the next downturn, meaning, jimmying the interest rates at the wholesale level to affect interest rates at the retail level to affect the money. So that's not enough. And they say the current policy space for global central banks is limited and will not be enough to respond to a significant, let alone a dramatic downturn. Okay, so what are they going to do about this? Fourth bullet point, let me just highlight it real quick. You need an unprecedented response. And so what is that response going to be? That response will likely involve going direct. And what does that mean? Going direct means the central bank finding ways to get central bank money, meaning wholesale money, on deposit at the Fed. You need to find a way to get the blue line directly in the hands of public and private sector spenders. Okay, so you need to get the blue money into the red circuit. You got to find a way to do that. And that's indeed what starts happening just 3 weeks later. Curiously enough, let's skip down farther in the plan. BlackRock dithers around here for a few pages before it picks back up on its going direct plan, meaning you need to take direct control of the retail circuit. So down there, fourth paragraph, go direct. Okay, what does that mean? Like we said, that is central bank crediting public or private sector accounts directly with money. So when you add the blue money, you need to add money to the retail circuit too. And that's just that. And that's exactly what happened 3 weeks later. And Totalitarian Larry even has a suggestion on what should be done with this new retail money. In other words, you've now got all this money sitting around, and it's really your creation, your double-headed Frankenstein, which you've cloned. What should the powers that be do with the new retail money? You should expand your monetary policy toolkit with an instrument that will be fiscal in nature, such as credit easing by way of buying equities. So put the money into the stock market, which is, of course, exactly what went on. The Fed bought assets from people that bought treasury bonds and bought mortgage-backed securities. They gave them money. They created money in the retail circuit. The sellers of the assets were in the retail circuit, and that money got into the stock market. And I have a video on that called Quantitative Easing, the Greatest Sham Ever, where I walk through it and explain how that works. But the BlackRock goes on for one last point and says, hey, you remember 2008, that little blip where you created the money and you created a little bit of red line money, but it reverted? Not good. When we create this new helicopter money in the red line in the retail circuit, it needs to be permanent. And so Totalitarian Larry and BlackRock say this boost to the stock of money has to be permanent. And so you can see in that graph, and I'm going to switch back to that graph real quick, that unlike here, back in the global financial crisis where you had a temporary blip in retail money, the red line goes up just for a second, it comes right back down. Here, what BlackRock is saying, when you start adding money to the retail circuit here, it needs to be permanent, and it's not revert back to the line, and it doesn't. It starts tracking the blue line immediately, and that is really that, and that's the reality. That whole plan, you just saw it, came from BlackRock. So allow me to summarize what we've just seen here. August 22nd, 2019, BlackRock tells the Fed, tells all central banks, go direct when the next downturn hits, buy equities. 9/11/19 comes, next downturn hits in the repo market, Fed goes direct, starts shunning wholesale money into the retail circuit for the first time ever. For the first time in the Fed's 106-year history, it is now using its power to create wholesale money to create retail money at the same time. February 2020, pandemic goes prime time. Everybody's freaking out. Oh, pandemic, freak out. March 2020, the freak out over pandemic, right in the thick of it. The Fed hires BlackRock to pick securities to buy, including securities that BlackRock owns. And over the next year, the Fed adds $3.5 trillion to both the wholesale and the retail market. So the wholesale monetary circuit adds $3.5 trillion. We saw that in blue. The retail circuit adds $3.5 trillion. We saw that in red. And guess what happens? Stock market doubles. And meanwhile, billionaires double or triple or quadruple their wealth through this scheme organized and spearheaded by BlackRock, planned by BlackRock in August 2019. It goes into effect. And meanwhile, while no one's looking, the Fed has just taken over a huge chunk of the retail money supply and begins talking. That clip from Carstens, and Jerome Powell's in that clip too, later on, begins talking about central bank digital currency. That clip is from October of 2020. So the Fed wastes no time, and right in the thick of the pandemic, while everybody's freaking out, pandemic, the Fed starts talking about central bank digital currency. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people are staring poverty in the face for the first time, and there's whispers of universal basic income that is going to be the hook to get into central bank digital currencies, as we will see. I guarantee you that. Millions of other people are facing foreclosure during this as the eviction moratorium now comes to an end. And guess who's been buying up houses all across the U.S. and probably all across the world? Yes, it would be BlackRock. BlackRock has been buying up houses, and now the moratorium is wearing off. And, so all of this is going on, and yet you might still think Pandemic is a documentary instead of the, production that it is. If you can't see the pretext that's going on here, the pretext that Pandemic represents for the Fed to undertake all these monetary moves and all these financial moves, I got some advice to you. Unplug your TV, wring your diaper out, and start following the Do-Re-Mi, because if you don't, you are going to be renting your diapers for the next 4 years as we get more and more productions. Okay, so we've had Pandemic. There's going to be Variant 1, Variant 2. We'll see the Mutant, the Cyber Hack, Climate Armageddon. It is going to be one fear porn production after another until the totalitarians get what they want, which is central bank digital currency and a leash around your neck for the rest of your life. So wake up. Okay, and the common emotion in all these productions is fear. The common remedy in all of these productions that you're going to see, and you've already started to see, is going to be lockdowns, it's going to be control, and it's going to be more money being hoovered up from the retail space it'll stay in the retail space, but it's going to go to billionaires, as we've already seen. We already saw that during the pandemic. That's why billionaires are getting richer. Okay, BlackRock is helping them. It's on both sides of the trade, telling them, hey, we're going to buy some bonds from you. Get ready, and it goes right into the stock market, and people get richer that way. Oh, again, watch my video, Quantitative Easing, the greatest sham ever. But to make no mistake about it, the people behind this want totalitarianism. You heard them at the top of this video. Larry Fink is very candid about liking totalitarianism and engaging in it through the Fed on both sides of the trade. And they're going to get it too. They're reaching for totalitarianism big time with CBDC. And you heard big boy Carstens talk about that and his lust for total absolute control over transactions. And if you doubt me about the transactions, watch the rest of that video. I've got a link in the description box where Carstens makes it clear. He's talking about blocking transactions. But they make these big strides in the direction of taking control during the pandemic, which is just the first of as many horror films as you're going to see, because they're going to need as many of these productions to freak people out while they are taking control. And they're going to get more and more control until they take full control and total control with central bank digital currency. Won't happen all at once. It'll happen in stages, but it's going to happen. Now, if you already understand, which you probably do if you're watching my channel, if you already understand what Pandemic is really all about, do me a favor and pass this video along to someone who might be showing the first signs of doubt. I've noticed more and more people are like, what's going on with this? You're starting to see signs of doubt. Make no mistake about it, it's a monetary event going on here. It's a reach for total control. And I'm going to tell you, when Total Larry and Big Boy Carstens talk reverently about totalitarianism and about absolute control, they damn well mean it. So consider yourself warned. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.